All right, so we're going to dive into something pretty wild today.
Okay.
Former President Trump, back for round two,
Round two, yeah.
is suggesting we get rid of FEMA.
Wow.
Yes, you heard that right.
Mhm.
The agency that usually steps in after hurricanes, floods, and
It's certainly a provocative statement, especially considering the timing.
Right.
He's making these comments while visiting communities impacted by Hurricane Helene in North Carolina
Uh-huh.
and those devastating wildfires we saw in Los Angeles.
Exactly. It's like he's chosen these disaster zones as the backdrop to announce a major policy shift.
Hmm.
I mean, FEMA is practically synonymous with disaster relief in the U.S.
Right.
What do you make of this?
Well, it's important to remember that Trump's relationship with FEMA hasn't exactly been smooth sailing in the past.
Right.
There were a lot of criticisms surrounding his administration's response to Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, for instance.
Right, the whole paper towel incident.
Yeah.
But this time, he seems to be going a step further, proposing that we essentially dismantle FEMA and let states take the reins on disaster response. What are the potential ramifications of such a drastic move?
It's a complex issue with far-reaching implications. One key concern is the potential for disparities in aid distribution.
Okay.
Some states might have the infrastructure and resources to effectively handle major disasters, while others could struggle significantly. This could result in a situation where aid is unevenly allocated, potentially leaving vulnerable communities at a disadvantage.
And wouldn't this shift in responsibility also put a heavier burden on states financially?
Absolutely. Disaster response is incredibly expensive, and many states simply wouldn't have the financial capacity to handle a major disaster on their own.
Right.
This raises questions about how federal funding would be allocated to states and whether it would be sufficient to meet the needs of those affected by disasters.
So let's look at Trump's visit to North Carolina. He was in Swannanoa, a town that was hit hard by Hurricane Helene back in September 2024. Homes were flooded. Residents were wading through waist-deep water. It was a devastating scene.
And while FEMA has already distributed over $319 million in aid to North Carolina, there's still a lingering sense of frustration and abandonment among many residents.
Really?
They're facing a long and difficult road to recovery, dealing with insurance claims, rebuilding their homes, and trying to get their lives back on track.
It's understandable that they might feel forgotten, especially given the scale of the destruction.
Oh.
What was the reaction to Trump's visit, given his stance on FEMA?
It's interesting because Swannanoa is a predominantly Democrat-leaning town.
Okay.
So there's a degree of skepticism surrounding Trump's intentions.
Uh-huh.
Some residents see his visit as an opportunity to bring attention to their plight and secure more assistance, while others view it as a political maneuver.
So his presence there is almost inherently controversial, adding another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. What specifically did he say during his visit? Did he offer any concrete solutions or just critiques of the current system?
He reiterated his dissatisfaction with FEMA, calling it bureaucratic and slow.
Okay.
Echoing some of the frustrations voiced by the residents themselves, however, he fell short of outlining a concrete plan for how states would effectively manage disaster response without FEMA's resources and expertise.
So there's this dissonance between the critique and the lack of a clear alternative.
Yeah.
And I'm sure his stance on FEMA is even more contentious in California, a state he's repeatedly clashed with in the past. What's the situation like there?
That's where we see the politicization of disaster aid coming into play even more starkly.
Okay.
In wildfire-ravaged Los Angeles, specifically the Pacific Palisades neighborhood where numerous homes were destroyed, Trump's response has been quite different. He's demanding concessions from the Democrat-led state in exchange for aid.
That's quite a stance.
Right.
What kind of concessions is he asking for?
He's pushing for changes to California's water policies, claiming that they exacerbated the wildfires. A claim that has been widely disputed by experts. He's also demanding changes to voter ID requirements,
Really?
which seem completely unrelated to the immediate needs of those affected by the fires.
It sounds like he's using the disaster as leverage to advance his own political agenda. How have California lawmakers reacted to these demands?
They've been incredibly critical, accusing him of holding disaster relief hostage to partisan politics.
Wow.
They argue that he's exploiting a tragedy for political gain instead of prioritizing the needs of those who have lost their homes and livelihoods.
So we have this situation where Trump's critique of FEMA, whether you agree with it or not, is playing out in a very real and complex way in these disaster-stricken areas.
It's definitely highlighting the tensions between federal and state powers, particularly in times of crisis.
Right.
And it raises crucial questions about the future of disaster relief in America, especially as climate change makes these events more frequent and intense.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's take a quick pause and then unpack these broader implications of climate change and its impact on disaster preparedness. We were just talking about the very real and immediate impacts of these recent disasters, but let's zoom out a bit and talk about the elephant in the room. Climate change, both Hurricane Helene and the California wildfires, were intensified by climate change, right?
Absolutely. The science is crystal clear on that Helene's rainfall was boosted by at least 10% because of climate change, and the wildfires were fueled by those record dry conditions in California, again linked to global warming.
And we know these types of disasters are going to become even more frequent and severe in the coming years. Yet we have a president who's skeptical of climate science and simultaneously proposing to dismantle the agency tasked with handling these very events. Isn't that a bit like refusing to buy fire insurance when your house is already on fire?
It's a striking parallel. Now, to be fair to those who support the idea of abolishing FEMA,
Right.
they often argue that it's a bloated bureaucracy, inefficient, and slow to respond.
Right. I've heard those arguments too, and there's no doubt that FEMA has had its share of missteps and challenges, especially in high-profile disasters like Hurricane Katrina, but is getting rid of it entirely the answer.
That's the million-dollar question. What does that even look like in practice? Who steps in when a hurricane slams into the coast or a wildfire rips through a community? Trump seems to envision a system where states take the lead, with the federal government providing financial support directly to them.
But wouldn't that create a whole other set of problems? Imagine a state that simply doesn't have the resources to handle a major disaster, or a state government that drags its feet on distributing aid, or even uses it for political leverage, much like what we're seeing with Trump's demands in California.
You're hitting on some key concerns. It could easily lead to an uneven playing field, with aid being distributed haphazardly and vulnerable populations falling through the cracks.
And let's not forget about expertise. FEMA, for all its flaws, has decades of experience in disaster response. They have the infrastructure, trained personnel, and established relationships with other agencies. Most states simply don't have that level of preparedness.
Exactly. It's like expecting a local fire department to suddenly manage a wildfire that's consuming an entire state. They might be great at handling house fires, but they're not equipped for that scale of disaster. FEMA has a national perspective and coordination capabilities that would be incredibly difficult to replicate at the state level.
So where does this leave us? We have a president who's openly hostile to a strong federal role in disaster relief. We have climate change making these disasters more frequent and more severe. And we have a system that seems ill-equipped to handle the growing demands. It's a bit of a perfect storm, isn't it?
It really is, and it underscores the need for a serious national conversation about how we prepare for and respond to disasters in this new reality we're facing. This goes beyond partisan politics. This is about people's lives, their livelihoods, their homes, their communities. As these disasters become more common, they're going to impact all of us in some way.
Absolutely. It's not a matter of if, but when. So what role do we as individuals and as communities want to play in this evolving landscape of disaster preparedness and response? What can we do to make our communities more resilient?
That's the crucial question. We can't just rely on the federal government or state governments. We need to be proactive, informed, and engaged.
Okay, so we've talked about Trump's critique of FEMA, his visits to these disaster-stricken areas, and the politicization of aid. We've also connected this to the larger context of climate change and the growing need for preparedness. Now, let's step back and consider, what does all of this mean for the future of disaster relief in America?
What we're witnessing is a collision of several long-term trends. The rising frequency and intensity of climate-related disasters, escalating costs of disaster response, and a growing debate about the role of government.
And it feels like these trends are coming to a head right now. Trump's presidency acting on the capital.
His call to get rid of them, whether it's a genuine policy proposal or a reform, is forcing us to confront fundamental questions about how we as a nation handle disasters in the 21st century.
Questions like, what is the appropriate balance between federal and state responsibility? How do we guarantee that aid is distributed equitably and efficiently? And crucially, how do we prepare for a future where these events will only become more common?
We also need to think about how we come together as a nation to address these challenges rather than letting them further divide us along political lines.
Because ultimately, this isn't a partisan issue. Disasters don't discriminate based on political affiliation. They affect everyone.
Exactly. What we need is a shift in focus from rhetoric and finger pointing towards practical evidence-based solutions, solutions that prioritize vulnerable communities and foster a sense of shared responsibility.
So what could those solutions look like?
Well, for starters, it means investing in climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. We need to reduce our carbon footprint, and we need to design more resilient infrastructure that can withstand the impacts of a changing climate. We can't keep rebuilding the same vulnerable structures in the same vulnerable locations.
Host speaker. So it seems like we're at a pivotal moment. We've got these converging trends of more frequent and intense disasters, escalating costs, and this fundamental debate about the role of government in disaster relief. Where do we go from here? What's the path forward?
You've hit the nail on the head. We're at a crossroads. And the decisions we make now, both individually and collectively, will have a profound impact on how we navigate these challenges in the years to come.
So let's talk about potential solutions. Yeah, you mentioned investing in climate change mitigation and adaptation as a crucial first step. Can you elaborate on what that might look like in practice?
Certainly, on a national level, it means enacting policies that incentivize the transition to clean energy, reduce carbon emissions, and promote sustainable practices.
Okay.
Think investing in renewable energy infrastructure, promoting energy efficiency, and supporting research and development of new technologies.
And what about adaptation measures? How do we make our communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change that are already happening?
Adaptation is all about preparing for the inevitable. It means designing infrastructure that can withstand more extreme weather events, updating building codes to reflect these changing realities, and developing early warning systems to give people more time to prepare for disasters.
So for coastal communities, that might mean investing in seawalls or elevating structures to mitigate the risks of rising sea levels and storm surges. And for areas prone to wildfires, it might mean creating defensible spaces around homes and implementing stricter land management practices.
Precisely. We need to be thinking long term and proactively adapting our communities to the new normal of a changing climate. But it's not just about physical infrastructure, it's also about building social resilience.
What do you mean by social resilience?
It's about strengthening community networks, fostering a sense of shared responsibility, and empowering individuals to take ownership of their own preparedness. It's about neighbors helping neighbors, sharing resources, and looking out for one another before, during, and after a disaster.
That sense of community seems even more crucial in a scenario where we might be seeing a shift away from reliance on federal agencies like FEMA.
Absolutely. We can't simply wait for the government to come to our rescue. We need to be proactive and take responsibility for our own safety and well-being. That means having a plan, knowing the risks in our communities, having emergency supplies on hand, and staying informed about potential threats.
It's a shift from a top-down approach to a more bottom-up, community-driven model of disaster preparedness and response.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and that we all have a role to play in building a more resilient future. It's about empowering individuals and communities to take ownership of their own destinies.
This has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I think the key takeaway is that we're facing complex and unprecedented challenges, but we also have the knowledge, the tools, and the capacity to address them. It's a matter of making informed decisions, prioritizing the right investments, and working together to create a more sustainable and resilient future for ourselves and generations to come.
I think that's a great note to end on. As always, we encourage you to continue this conversation, to share your thoughts, and to take action in your own communities. Remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to facing the challenges of a changing world. That's it for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.